But what's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in. I'm so stoked to bring you some people this week. And I've got my good friend here, Nick Zegel. He's my co-host. We're just gonna have like a little conversation here. And just to give you a little brief background on mine and Nick's relationship, we've worked together. We're also friends, and I've always had some really great conversations with Nick. He's one of those people that I look at, and I just feel like he can do anything great in the art world. And it's really inspiring for me personally to see somebody who can take pictures, who can put together ad campaigns, who can draw and paint, who can have intellectual conversations, has a point of view. And I really think that he'll be like an asset here. So Nick, welcome. I'm stoked to have you.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Hell yeah. So I guess, we'll just start, since the whole premise of all of this is creativity. I think you're, one of the more creative people that I know personally. Does creativity kind of start with you forever, or like there's so many things I want to talk about. I feel like I'll just throw a broad question out and see maybe where it lands us. Where did creativity, I guess, strike you, and where do you feel like it fits with you?
It's a pretty multifaceted question, I think. But I find, for me personally, creativity also kind of intermingles with curiosity. And that a lot of my creativity is inspired by my curiosity and wanting to know more, wanting to see more, wanting to learn more.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that makes sense. I feel like, creativity is maybe just questions, and that's like a really cool way. I don't know if I've thought of it that way, but yeah, if you're curious about like this or that, diving into it, I guess, with creativity. Some approach things, with a scientific background. Some people approach things with, just asking questions. Is that what creativity is for you? You're just asking it? Are you trying to answer a question with your artwork?
I mean, so for those who don't know too much about like what I do, I mean, my primary kind of function as a professional is as an art director, as a graphic designer. And this is a service industry. So unlike like the purest form of the creative arts, I guess, and being kind of this self-serving creative pursuit of like making something that only you could make and is totally for you and yourself. The first stop in my creative journey, or my day-to-day functionality as a creative person, oftentimes starts with being of service to someone else. And I find a lot more, I think like sometimes my creative strength, or my my willingness or wanting to help others solve a problem is what sparks a lot of creativity. So give me a problem and I'm going to start going. Like that to me is like a great spark, a great beginning point for my creativity.
Yeah. So are you a planner? Does that mean, so like if somebody gives you an idea, do you plan it out, or do you let it happen, or where's your creative process and what's your flow feel like?
The idea of planning is a funny one because it's something that I've avoided doing my entire life. Oftentimes joke with friends about living life with no plan, which we call the no plan plan. But when it comes to creative pursuits, I literally was up last night at around midnight writing an email summarizing a meeting that I had, like really laying out a plan and really like laying out the steps to achieve the maximum creative output, I guess, for some little project we're working on. So I think that there's kind of a balance there. If that answers kind of your question.
Yeah. So wait, is that surprising to you then, that you're like this planner and you're like, dude, I'm on the no plan, but then here you are, you catch yourself, you're like, wait, am I making a plan right now?
Yeah, 100%. I think I am often surprised by things that reveal themselves within my day-to-day practice, or within my day's work, often I often like loved breaking the rules as a kid, or like loved the idea of me as a rule breaker, but then I've created all these rules in my head that are often sometimes difficult to break, which is definitely an interesting space to explore creatively.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, immediately you said you were like you want to be a rule breaker, and I feel the same way in many ways. I like, like you're telling me I have to do it this way. I'm like, fuck that. I want to do it a different way, So, and then like I went on to think, I'm like, oh man, that really makes sense that you're a skateboarder then too. I think like, there's sort of that like the creativity, you want to break rules, and like skating, is kind of like, maybe when we were younger, it was more of a rule breaker thing. I don't know, like I'm not that familiar with it, but maybe it still is to this day. But that rule breaker thing is sort of an interesting thing. Do you still like to break rules, and if so, like which ones do you feel like you like to bend?
Well, not to tie it back to like your first question, but as it relates to creativity, I think like something that I've come across is in my design education, in maybe my education as a creative, has been like rules are made to be broken, and yet at the same time, through my, I guess, living life on a skateboard, et cetera, there's opportunities to break rules that I love and like thrive on that. And then there's other opportunities or other places in which rules present themselves that I really like to fall in line with. So maybe that answers the question. I can't.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I feel like, like having rules, as let's say, an artist personally, can go either way. Like, like we all have rules probably to some degree. Like I like this color better than that color, or I want to do these things and I don't want to do those things. But when working directly with a client, let's frame it through like the art director lens. There's certain rules that you have to go along with. I guess I'd say your personal freedom and creativity is probably a lot easier, though I would argue maybe sometimes it's really difficult because you're like, oh, what do I want to do? But when you're given sort of a directive, following these rules probably helps your work in a certain way. But what about when you want to be creative in your professional work and you feel like you want to break some rules? How do you balance that?
Let's see. Within my professional work, I've been really lucky to be in a couple different situations that allowed maximum creativity with very little rules. As an art director for Girl Skateboards for 4.5 years, I was presented this opportunity to kind of just come up with ideas on a daily basis for new skateboard designs. And within that structure, you've got a skateboard and you can put anything on it. The biggest challenge there was making sure it fell within the brand voice, or like the expected, I guess, aesthetic of like the particular brand that I was working for, which was there for me also to like tweak and mold and define. And I think as like an art director working with clients, you have to take into consideration who it is you're working with and for, and what it is that not only you perceive them to be, but what their customers and the outside public perceives them to be, because that can be two very different things. And you have to find a place to coexist within this world of like maintaining the work that's come before you and building upon it. So that takes some creative perspective all in itself.
Yeah. Well, yeah, also like being able to push, maybe it's got to be sort of a little nerve wracking maybe to put a creative idea forward, because you want to bend some of these rules, or maybe you want to help push the brand in a certain way. How do you try and like figure between, all right, how much of this should I push and how much of this should I just let go and just allow them to maybe keep their status quo? Like maybe you see it a certain way that you'd like to maybe take it. How do you know when to stop pushing, maybe, I guess, your creativity, and how do you know when to stand up confidently?
That's a great, is conundrum the right word? I'm not sure, but
I think so, yeah.
That is something that I deal with on a regular basis. And oftentimes, not only am I dealing with like how to let something go or how to not like how to push just enough to get like a creative idea to come to life, but knowing when that idea is, you kind of have to have the confidence in your ideas, the confidence in your work to push as hard as you need to push. And I sometimes look at other people's work and, whether they be colleagues or heroes, and I sometimes see something that I know took a full on push to make a reality, or at least like I want to think that, because how the hell could you get away with like such unbelievable creativity and explain that to someone before actually executing, right? So like a part of, I think a big part of getting away with or pushing your agenda is having the confidence to do so. And when you say knowing when to pull back or knowing when to kind of take a loss, I mean, I take many losses on a weekly or monthly basis. And sometimes I'll create that loss for myself. I don't necessarily like that about, don't necessarily like doing that, but I think you and I have talked a little bit about like resistance, or like the ideas that are in that book, The War of Art. But these things that happen, whether it's a lack of confidence or whether it's just like, I don't know, lack of follow through, they present themselves boundaries and set themselves up like to make getting stuff done more difficult. And I will do that sometimes to prevent myself from having to go the full push to a client, if that makes sense.
So wait, you're saying you put in like a couple different steps as like fail stops, or?
Yeah, I'm almost like, I think that creatively when I'm like, I come up with an idea, right? Hey, I have like this problem to solve for a client. I have an idea. I kind of start to talk to them about it. I feel out like where they stand, but then I start to realize the things that are going to need to fall in place to make that idea a reality. And sometimes the things that would need to happen are a little bit beyond my control. Maybe they require money. Maybe we need to hire someone else. Maybe we need, X, Y, and Z. And if some of those things can be excuses to not do it, like I've found myself taking that excuse and just taking the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And
when you do something like that, do you find that you're trying to balance maybe in another way to sort of fulfill that, like, because letting go of something, especially creatively, can feel really tough, especially if you really believe in the idea, and maybe either because it's like a work constraint and it's not the right client, or you can't move forward with it. Maybe it's personal work and you've decided, like, you're like, all right, I finished this, I can move on. Is there a way that you kind of reinvigorate your own work, and like does that give you sort of like an added self-confidence that maybe that, like, I guess, spills over into the rest of what you do?
That's a good question. Without speaking too much in tongues, which I feel like I was just doing to not make such a clear example of like what it is I'm talking about, I think what you're asking is whether or not, I don't know, can you say that again? Like, it's like,
Yeah, so I guess, so to relate it directly to myself, let's say, like, I shoot like a lot of events, and I'm like, okay, this stuff isn't necessarily creative fulfilling. I can do it. My clients are happy. I can get the work done. I'm happy doing it, whatever. But maybe it doesn't necessarily scratch that itch that's inside that, like, is really pushing me to be out and see nature, or like see something brand new, or like a new experience. And I noticed that if I work too much, I sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I just want to put the camera down, and I'm like not necessarily excited about it. So me personally, I know that for the key ingredients for keeping me happy in my medium is to push myself for new things, go travel, or just force myself outside to walk around and look at stuff, bring a camera. So what do you do personally, in, let's say, through the lens of your artwork, to keep your creativity spirits high?
right. Well, that makes things much easier to kind of think about. I think uh, for me, like I see you, Ryan, as a photographer, right? And forgive me for just seeing you in such a one-dimensional
No,
fashion.
please. Yeah,
Also
whatever. Fine.
as a friend, but I'm like, oh, Struck, he's a great photographer. I've set myself up with this interesting and yet super fulfilling approach towards the creative work that I do, because I'm like very multidisciplinary. As you said, like I love picking up a camera and trying to like get the results that like I would otherwise like rely on a professional for, you know?
Mm.
And and by exploring those things, by picking up a pen and pencil, by getting on the computer, by making a painting, by shooting a photograph, creating this variety in my life kind of like refreshes the other elements or the other aspects of the work that I do. And that doesn't mean that I won't get into like, the equivalent of maybe shooting an event for you. I get into the nitty gritties of like, reformatting images and ads and building catalogs where it's really technical work or maybe less creative, but yet it still can be fulfilling because I'm serving like the needs of a client, and fulfilling my duties as a professional. But the variety, I think, going back to your question, in my work keeps things fresh.
Yeah. Dude, well, like when you're kind of creating these other things, besides like, your personal work and your professional work, and like when you can like kind of melt them together is kind of when I feel like I'm in the most like the best creative flows when kind of both are happening. And obviously that's like such an ideal world. And I'm finding, at least me personally, that my personal work and my professional work don't often um, melt, perfectly. It's either I'm working on one or the other. Sometimes, it's like a blend, and sometimes I see one as a way to achieve the other too. Just as an aside, just to build off of what you were saying. But one thing I wanted to talk about was your like role as an art director. I feel like since you are multi-talented, I'd say this is like a great way that fulfills your role, because as an art director, you have your hands in a lot of different things. You can be hiring photographers, you can be executing designs, like I feel like, whereas let's say like I'm a photographer, filmmaker, you could put me in those boxes. Um, your role is just, you get to do a lot of different things. And just me knowing you personally, I feel like that's got to be such a fulfilling thing for you.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I've talked about, and Nancy, I see your question. I think I'll get to that. But I think, um, yes, it is fulfilling. But yes, it's also intentional. Um, I remember taking like, or pursuing filmmaking at a young age, not quite pursuing, but exploring it. Being lucky enough to kind of go to a weekend class for a few weeks in Philadelphia and learn a little bit about like what filmmaking looks like, and discovering that like, hey, in the traditional sense, you don't shoot, direct, edit, act all on your own. You rely on a team.
Absolutely.
And for better or for worse, I didn't like the idea of like shooting something and letting it go and letting someone else edit it, because
Mm,
I like to have control of everything, and maybe that's a little bit of a fault of mine, and it's one that I'm like exploring all these years later, 15 years into like a career basically, realizing, oh, like relying on a team can really produce like some really great results. So how do I harness the power of a team? How do I communicate, from an art director's perspective? How do I communicate something to yield results that are, the results that I want? And that for me has been a really trying and new experience, and also pretty inspiring, a new challenge really.
yeah, new is good, man. It's kind of like what really enables you to stay engaged in, the medium, whether that's like, photo, filmmaking, design, like, like learning something new, I think is such an asset. And sometimes they're like, it's a little bit of a growing pain, but like once, like you said, you're realizing like, oh, it's actually kind of cool to have like a team. Like then they can go out and they can edit something and you can still oversee it, you still kind of have like a bit of control over what the creative's going to look like, or the branding, or like, the execution of whatever the project may be.
Yeah, totally. I think, the trick there, and I've experienced this firsthand, is working with a team, getting the results you want, and then working with a team and not getting the results you want. And that has probably been one of the biggest challenges of my like creative career profession is getting like, is what to do when it doesn't all work out. And, I think we talked a little bit about shortcomings or like kind of hiccups or, whatnot, and navigating that has been really a whole new world of challenge.
What do you do, man? What do you do?
Well, I think first and foremost, the thing that I kind of go back to, and I don't practice this as much as I maybe should, but putting the work in really is essential. And by that, I mean, like, for me to sit here and kind of say whatever comes to mind and have a conversation with you is one thing. But when working on executing an idea and leading a team, I mean, I think that there's like a lot more work required than writing a single email, and whether that's illustrating your ideas with storyboards or, detailed shot lists when it comes to photography, when it comes to marketing, like building a framework or building a plan for people to execute, and managing, again, individuals and people, but also managing the tasks that need to happen. And again, like I said, that takes work, and it's not a part of the process that should be overlooked.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I feel you. I think that shit, man.
I don't know
It's
where
tough, dude. It's tough to think about, especially, I feel like you're also your role, the way that I look at like my work, let's say, versus yours as a photographer. I can come up with an idea and a plan and execute it. And this has happened, dude. I've worked for, like, I've shot for brands. I've gotten the photos that they've wanted, whatever. And then the photos never even like come to being used. Like they sit on a hard drive. I got paid for that work, and like they're not even using those images, So like sometimes things can just go in a direction. Like, dude, I've like I've been sent to work like outside of my own state to go shoot these people and to organize these things and all this stuff, and then like nothing just happens. And to me, I'm like, of course I want to see my work live out in the world, but I think about it from their perspective. I'm like, dang, they just spent a bunch of money and like they're not even using this content that we made, So I think that is like, for me, my side, I've always been a little baffled on that, but I know there's so much more that's happening and so much more at play that really kind of goes into that.
Yeah, that brought up or sparked a little idea that I don't know how relevant it is, but it's funny to hear from your perspective, like this idea of shooting something or creating something that's not used. From the design perspective, and I had a funny, actually, conversation with a friend yesterday who was exploring some design, actually needing to do some design, but had very little experience. So he's jumping in, he's kind of willing to just, let me try this, Hey, do you have any tips? Hey, can you show me like a little bit? We do a FaceTime for about 20, 30 minutes. And I'm just kind of pointing them in the right directions. And he comes back to me like a half hour later and I think he was just a little bit blown away that like he had just spent like an hour, very little amount of time really in the grand scheme of things, pushing an idea, pushing something that he was going to then put out in front of someone for critique and potentially have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again, like from the perspective of a designer, right? I think he was like experiencing this for the first time. And from the perspective of a photographer, going and shooting something and having it not see the light of day, of course, you've done that many, many times, I'm sure. But from a design point of view, when I work on something, it's usually, it's very often a given that I will try a few different things. And especially when it kind of comes back to like a logo or an identity or an ad layout or really anything that I can think of, I'm trying a bunch of different options. And man, there's a lot that doesn't see the light of day. I've never worked in an ad agency, but I had a friend, I've freelanced for them, but never like the full grind. But I remember talking to a friend that I really admire his work, and he had gone a year without working on a project to see the light of day.
Dang.
So, you know, that stuff is pretty unbelievable. And, you know, you and I could sit here and say, oh, what a waste of resources. But the end product should be hopefully better for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because you know, I on a smaller scale, you know, I've clients will ask me to pitch. I'll pitch on stuff all the time. You know, like whatever. Some like you know, last spring I felt like I pitched on like maybe 5 different things, and like you know, really you're making a deck and a treatment for free. You know, like but like it's you realize you're putting in all this work because you want the end product to be great. And to go back to what we were saying, like about planning, I also consider myself, you know, like not really a planner, but when it comes to my work or if it comes to like, you know, a pitch, I'm like pretty organized and definitely plan and think it through because, you know, a lot of time is going to go into this stuff. A lot of money is going to go into this type of stuff. Um, and having sort of like a plan is really important. But also even on smaller scale shoots, I've started like really putting together like pitch decks or like, you know, treatments a bit more because it organizes me and it makes me think a certain way and it really helps me. So even at the end of the day, if let's say I don't get hired, but I spent a whole lot of time and energy making this treatment, during that whole process of the treatment, what that teaches me is also, do I really want this job too? Because I have to think about all the parts and all the things that kind of go into it. So I think maybe even though we're not maybe planners, planning can really help somebody really identify the strong and the weak points to something.
100%. I'm working currently. Well, I mean, I need to be working on something to assist me in my, you know, goal to set up, you know, this design studio I'm running now to like kind of take steps forward. I'm working on, you know, essentially creating like a process guide that includes essentially a questionnaire or a like upfront homework assignment for potential clients. And when you think about like the work that's going to take on my end, I mean, it's definitely not a small project, but it's something that I can do. But what it'll do is push a potential client as well to do some work up front to get past some of the things that I think you and I probably have dealt with and creatives everywhere deal with when being hired to execute a project. You know, oftentimes the hirer or the person, you know, calling isn't ready and willing to give you the time and energy that they need to in order for you to be successful.
Well, that makes me think immediately of like kind of like, you know, a questionnaire is great. It's what a good idea because it'll force people to think or, you know, to have them, you know, I don't know if I'm using the right word, survey or like, you know, like, but it'll allow them to think more about their idea. Because I'm sure you've experienced like when somebody comes to you like, hey, we want to do this thing. And you're like, okay, well, what's your plan or what's your idea? And like, I don't know, but like, we just want to do this. Like, how do you deal with like maybe client education? You know, like, because a lot of times I'd love if people like just came to me and understood my process, but I think sometimes, I mean, it's easier, let's say with larger brands, because maybe they're shooting or they're designing or they're working on big, large scale things, or maybe they've invested a lot of money into doing that. So they know they have a better idea maybe. But what happens when somebody approaches you and maybe you have to give them a little bit of education? How do you start with something like
that? Let's see. I mean, I totally hear what you're saying. And I think that on a case-by-case basis, I sometimes handle everything differently, for better or for worse. I had a really funny experience this weekend where I got like a cold call from, you know, someone who had found my work online, and his kids are trying to start a skateboard brand, and he wants to hire me.
Got it.
So, and I'm thinking, oh, you know what? Like, this might not be exactly what I am looking for. no matter how much money he has, like having done work for some of the bigger skateboard brands, to kind of come back down. Not that I am above it, but this is a guy whose 8-year-old son just needs a project. But that's not to shortchange the power and the creativity and the passion that this kid has for maybe starting his own brand. But it really like made me, I made myself available to them. So I said, hey, call me up. And we had a really great conversation, like with the family, who's all just, hunkered down in these kind of crazy times, just looking to like put some energy into like a fun project. And I pushed them a little bit to explore some of the things that you're talking about, right? So from the perspective of like, hey, we want to start something, we have a name. Or, hey, we want to start something, I love the color red. Or, and I brought up a lot of different things, but a lot of those things that I brought up were questions for that person to answer. So it kind of goes back again to this idea of planning, to presenting someone else, the person that's going to hire you, with questions and with some homework to push through, and explore, I guess, what it is they're thinking. I don't know if that's branding.
No, that makes sense, dude. Well, I mean, isn't branding just a logo? Dude, all I need is a logo, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's funny because I've done logos for, you name the dollar amount, and like I've done it, don't get too high, but everywhere like below that. And, more and more these days, like I'm looking for a more thorough, more invested process, only to allow me to like do bigger and better things and be more creative. But at the same time, it can be simplified, but it has to be thought out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Nancy's got a question here that I wanted to get into, and everybody else, feel free to start dropping stuff into the chat box there that we have for questions. But Nancy's asking, how would you recommend convincing a superior that staying with your brand, especially for social media, is important?
So I'm going to go ahead and assume that staying with your brand means not leaving.
Staying on brand, yeah.
Staying on brand, yeah. Not leaving, but staying on brand, especially for social, is important. So how would you convince them? Well, I think first and foremost, making sure that you're on the same page with what your brand is and is critical. So depending on, it says you work here for a small nonprofit. Do you guys have brand guidelines? Do you have a brand book? I've actually developed a brand identity and a brand book for a nonprofit. So I've been through that. A lot of times it's a brand voice as well, especially when it comes to social media. So I think about like the Budweiser commercial, like, what's up? Like, blah. How that is such a definitive voice, right? Like that on the back end, people who drink Budweiser are going to act like that, and they're speaking to that audience. When it comes to your nonprofit, I'm going to go ahead and guess that your audience is going to speak a little bit differently than that. But first and foremost, laying out and looking at what the brand voice and the brand identity and the guidelines are is a great first step. And so if you have all that already, and that's all laid out, then how do you convince someone that staying on brand is important? Let's see. How would you do it, Ryan?
Staying on brand. Man, the way that my take is going to be a little different. This is where my experience in, let's say, branding is not, I'd say, as strong. I mean, I have my own personal brand, and what I actually I've been teaching in my mentorship class is we're talking about the idea of messaging right now, and like what message you're putting forward. So I don't know if this is going to directly relate, Nancy, but like the way that I feel is that I'm only going to put out stuff that like I believe in. Let's say I'm talking about social. Right now, I can't really do a lot of the things that I typically like to do and shoot and share. I can't really go travel. I'm not out in the world that much. Like, like I'm going fishing, I'm going to the beach. I'm not hanging with friends. Um, and I'm sort of staying on that track just because it's, you know, what we should be doing right now. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to share my work. And I know my message right now is not to talk. I'm not going to talk about the pandemic. I'm not a medical person. I'm not like a news reporter or anything like that. But what I do, I think at the end of the day, what my message inside is that I want to let everybody else know that the experience out in the world that I see and share is one that everybody else can see for themselves. So I'm kind of it's I want to put out a message of positivity because that's what always helps me, as well as inspiration if I can. I mean, that's the whole thinking behind having these videos and these talks, to just share them for free, because we're all inside, and I know that I have like a point of view that I want to just share with other people in the purest form. So that's my message, and that's how I'm staying on brand. And for me, it feels like a switch, because my message has been, look at, I can make this picture and I can put it online, or I can make this film or this video that's for another brand, or or is something that interests me, and I can put it out. Look, I've cultivated this thing where I can visually show you what I'm seeing. Now my message is changing to a degree, because I want to show other people that you can also do this. So I'm having like this, I'm trying to stay on brand while still letting myself evolve, if that makes sense. um so like that's kind of my thoughts. I don't know how to speak from a brand point of view. I just know how to speak from myself, and that's like I feel like I'm not qualified enough to guide a brand, but from my perspective, sometimes I do. Even, you know, it's the reason why I asked Nick you about that question, like how, when do you
Yeah, I
know
didn't
when
mean
to
to throw it
stop?
back on you.
No. When I
I was buying some time.
no, I feel you. No, it's cool because like it sparked an idea in my mind, because that's why I asked you, because I was naturally curious. I'm like, when do you stop pushing a brand? Because sometimes a brand comes to me and they're like, hey, we don't really know what we want to do, but we need to create some content. Do you have an idea? And that's when my brain starts spinning, you know. And then I'm like, oh, okay. And that's when I start like building a treatment. And that's when I try and putting, you know, these little tests out to see, is this something that's going to work? Um, you know, but from my own perspective, like if I love the idea and I think it's great, I push it. But I don't know the brand perspective. I've never sat in the brand seat.
Well, think
Like, you know,
about,
go ahead.
yeah, think about like a lot of what you're talking about. It requires effort, energy, and time, right? So, I mean, to try and give Nancy a little bit more of a specific answer, how do you convince someone to stay on brand?
Yeah.
Like after you both shake hands and say, hey, we agree that this is the brand, we agree that this is our voice. Um, how do you convince someone to stay on track? Could kind of be, um, could kind of come back to, hey, listen, we're all sitting here putting in time and energy and effort, to send a message, to tell a story, to improve our, standing amongst, our competition, improve our awareness. If people don't recognize us, then if people don't see us and kind of become familiar with us, then that effort is going to yield less results, or it will be lost in the mix, right? So if I'm coming out, and this is really breaking things down in the most simple form, but if I'm coming out as like the orange guy, and everything I do is orange, 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 and then I just feel like, it's Easter time, maybe I'll switch it up to like a pale blue just for like the one time go. Someone might see that and just blow past it and not recognize it as me, because
Right.
I've always been the orange guy. She says that's a big deal. So it's funny because color can be such a big part of a brand. But that doesn't mean you can't, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, break the rules, right? But if you do break one rule, you don't need to, but I would recommend there being some other form of continuity. So typeface is like a great example within branding. Whereas if there's a consistency in typeface throughout, then maybe your color scheme can be flexible. Maybe you have secondary and tertiary colors that you can fall back on that allows you some more flexibility. When it comes to photography, when it comes to imagery, I mean, you would know better than most, like the many different ways you can present a photo as it relates to color, as it relates to style. I shoot a lot of sneakers nowadays, right? Maybe not like, sometimes I'm behind the lens, but oftentimes I'm, just kind of processing images, directing images to be shot, and we shoot in an environment for clarity, right? That typically is for use on a sales front. But when it comes to advertising, like clarity might not be like my first and foremost, like, that might not be the thing that I want most. I might want drama, right? And I can shoot an object, maybe a sneaker, with dramatic lighting. I can make this image of a sneaker be dramatic, whether it's on a model or whether it's in a studio. Let's just keep it in the studio for sake of clarity, so there's so many different ways you can approach an image. There's a lot of different ways you can like change the color of your brand, or let's just say maybe your color remains consistent and someone's trying to change all the typefaces every month. Those are things that need to be massaged and taken,
Well, it's like having an anchor. It's like you have to have something that anchors the brand throughout, and you can push and pull certain things, but there's got to be like, like you're saying, like the typeface, it's always going to be the same. That's your anchor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That can definitely, it's an easy thing that a lot of people overlook, but hopefully that somewhat answers, was it Nancy's question?
Yeah, Nancy's question. Cool. Well, yeah, if anybody else wants to throw them out, we're about at like the 40-minute mark, so we'll start wrapping up. But we're happy to take some questions here. Nick's a wealth of information and definitely pick his brain while he's here.
Pick my brain. You can hit me on the email too if you want.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna put all your links out to everybody, your social and your website and everything, so that everybody can.
Yeah, one of the things, just having this conversation with you, Ryan, it's funny because, even just this past weekend when I'm on the phone with these kids trying to start a brand, it's like, it's helping me work through some of these ideas as well. So, participating in a conversation like this, reaching out to the people around you to kind of further understand what it is we're doing on a regular basis is so helpful. And I think it's a really important part, going all the way back to the very beginning, a really important part of like staying creative, right? Is having people to bounce those ideas off of, having people to like work through things with. And
absolutely.
While sometimes we feel like we're lone soldiers out there trying to make something of nothing, it's important to remember that, you're not alone in that pursuit.
Yeah, 100%, man. That's the whole idea here, is just to try and connect the dots creatively for everybody, even if we're all, away from each other, because I think it's important. I think, speaking for me personally, I love to create on my own. I really enjoy solitude, alone time, that kind of stuff, but I'm also like a social person. And then even, dude, bring creativity in and like bounce ideas off of other people. They give you new ones, you give them new ones. It's really kind of how the whole process works. There's so many different facets to it, but being able to speak with other creative minds is kind of like what like, sends the beacon out, like, oh man, like, wait, this idea or that idea. I think it's really helpful. So
for sure.
Cool. Well, thanks, dude. Thanks so much for being here, man. I really enjoyed. We got another question. As the brand evolves and changes, how important do you think a quick, focused rebrand is, as opposed to the journey and even showing on social media and publicly organizing or organically finding that right brand?
It's funny. One thing I was talking about, I made a little note. I should have written down more things that we talked about. But as we were talking about kind of Nancy's question earlier, I've thought about this idea of evolution and the idea of change as it relates to branding, as it relates to like us as individuals, as creatives, and knowing that those things are inevitable. And so as a brand, as a person, as a creative, when you want to shoot things differently, when you want to design things differently, or maybe you want to like reach out of your normalcy of what it is you do and kind of grow. A brand can do the same thing. So what you're saying is through that evolution, through those changes, a quick focused rebrand as opposed to the journey kind of allowing itself to organically drift and become itself. I'm experiencing that right now with the branding of my own self. and I'm struggling with that because I've started my own design studio. It's called Nick, so I've named it after myself for the sake of like, I don't know, simplicity. There's some kind of irony to it. There's a lot of like honesty, just like, hey, tear down the walls, like who's inside, like, you know, it's me. But I want to kind of like work to build this brand to be less about me as an individual and more about like an ethos and more about like a set of ideas. And so as you evolve or like as the brand changes, I don't think it's horrible to allow people to peek behind the curtain. I think realness right now is not only like trending, but it's like the best. It's like I go back, honesty is the best policy. So like tear down the walls. Like if you allow people to see you for you and you and when I say you, I mean your brand or you as an individual, like that may be the best thing for you as long as what's inside is real and true and working hard and showing up and doing the work, because you can't hide, you know, behind a pretty brand, no matter like how beautifully designed it is, if your product sucks or if you don't do good work. So.
Yeah, man. I mean, dude, I think just it's so funny because I mean, you just hear it and it just sounds trendy, but like just being your authentic self, I mean, yeah, but it's so damn true. You know, it's like just putting yourself forward. And if that's your authentic brand voice, or if it's your own personal voice, just putting yourself forward is just like the easiest way to let people see through. Cause you don't,
But
you
let
don't
me
want to
jump
put up
in
a
right
facade.
there.
Huh?
Let me jump in on that real quick.
Go ahead.
Because I agree. I couldn't agree more. Like that is a great thing. And again, just like I like pulling down like the curtain and just showing people who I am. It's scary. And you know, the vulnerability that I'm working to show more often is, I feel like, pushing me to new creative places and new growth. But when you say like being your true authentic self, the thing that I thought of, and maybe it's a little off base, but just how in this connected, just kind of swirling of information that we like live in and deal with on a regular basis, people are noticing like aesthetically some sort of kind of like homogeny, or like some sort of like kind of a basic, oh, everyone looks the same, or everything looks the same. And within design, like, you know, these are the colors that everyone's been using, and like, will this ever change? And so when you are kind of like presenting that authentic self, I just thought of it, I don't know how relevant it is, but like that authentic self like is going to be influenced by a lot of the same things that your next door neighbor or your competitor is influenced by, right? So this is now creatively going to push us not only to like be true to ourselves, but like push us to go look in more inside, whether that inside look is literally like closing your eyes and meditating, or if it's like looking at the bookshelf of books that you didn't buy this past year, but like over the course of your life, that's going to tell you in a better way, like who it is you are, as opposed to like, I don't know.
Well, what do you mean by like so I mean, me by saying like putting myself forward and being like my authentic self, I definitely mean like going deep, you know, like I like to write a bunch, and that's not something I always share, but I tend to think more about my writing and be more mindful and purposeful and put that forward. I don't, maybe being your authentic self is a little too broad. I guess I'm not sure what
No, I think it scared me. I think
Oh,
like I heard that and I was just like, it scared me maybe for like a silly reason because I was like, oh no, like not, I was like, oh no, what if we are all our authentic selves and we all end up looking the same, you know? So I was
oh,
like,
no way, man. No way. We're like fingerprints, man. Dude, there's like, I mean, what's gonna make me tick is what's gonna, is gonna be completely different than what makes somebody else tick. But like, and being my authentic self doesn't mean I'm like, let's say going out on social and updating what I'm doing every second of the day or whatever. I think it's being more like trying to look inward, be more purposeful and like discovering who I am. And then, using an appropriate filter to put that forward. Because like,
yeah,
if I'm having a terrible day, I'm not putting that on social. Like, I sometimes, maybe occasionally, if I feel like it's the right message, because I think I'm like, all right, other people could connect with this, and also I'm also to the same degree, I'm not putting out like my biggest joys out there either. Like, I think, and I'm framing everything through the lens of maybe my work. Some of my personal work, I try and chip away at the surface of myself, and I even try and understand like, why is it that I'm doing this stuff, or like, what am I taking these pictures of, or like, is this anything? And sometimes I'm like, maybe I'm thinking too much.
yeah,
But yeah, like when it comes to branding, like I said before, I yield. I that's like that's something I know a little bit about, and but yeah, like how does a brand be an authentic brand, and how, like corporations are people too, brands, like, wait, how does that mix,
yeah. I don't love that idea of corporations are people too, but I love the idea of a brand having personality and being authentic, you know? And even if it's something that you make up out of thin air, if you stay true to it, then there's authenticity there, right?
Oh yeah.
So maybe I was a little lost in my quick reaction to your.
No, I like it, dude. I love it. I think that was great.
It's just like, ooh.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I mean, if there's no questions, we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for everybody joining in. This was awesome. Not only did it scratch all my curiosities, it was really cool to hear Nick's thoughts, and I really enjoyed this, dude. Thanks, man. As
Yeah, thank
always.
you guys for tuning in as well. Hopefully I'll meet you guys someday, but yeah, feel free to hit me up if there's any questions, need for design, whatever else. But Ryan, it's always fun chatting with you. I appreciate our conversations.
Yeah, man. Yeah, likewise. Cool. All right. Well, I'll see y'all soon, and thanks, Nick. See ya.
Yeah, stay safe, guys. Appreciate it. Big love.
Later.